Welcome back, WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and WNST.net. We are pretty much at opening day here. We're getting up on it, Luke Jones, and, I would say this. There's not any hope springing eternal for the Orioles, but I think if you're ever going to buy into the soap opera and get a little bit interested, they might be winless when they get home on opening day at home for real, the following week. They'll get it going against the Yankees, and here comes the season. And, I have some questions. I think we all do about all of this, and we've talked so much about analytics and Sig Mejdal and Mike Elias and the face of the organization and the changes and Buck Showalter. Let's talk about some holdover here, right? Where's Brady Anderson? I'm not even being flippant. I'm just wondering, has he been hitting fungos down in the cage? And Sarah, is he working with kids? Where is he in all of this? Because it feels like he's there, but I haven't heard a word about him in 6 months.
Well, but isn't that a good thing, though? I don't really know. Having not been down to Sarasota myself, there hasn't been much said about him. From what I know, Mike Elias has been asked at a couple of different points and confirms Brady is still part of the organization and has been a sounding board. Certainly, Mike Elias and Sig Mejdal and new coaches and Brandon Hyde and anyone that's new to this organization is still going to lean on some of the incumbents that are still around, whether you're talking about a Brady or a Gary Kendall who's going to manage AAA Norfolk, promoted from Bowie. They're leaning on those guys to really get a good feel. And now, having had spring training, they have their own impressions and opinions and evaluations that they've made. But to this point, to me, silence and a lesser role is kind of what you want, isn't it? That's if he's going to be in the organization, but is going to have a more clearly defined role, whether it's strength and conditioning and nutrition, which he's done plenty of that, then that sounds okay. If it's a case of there being potentially a confusion with the chain of command, that's what people are concerned about. And certainly we saw questions about that during the Duquette-Showalter era. So I think that's kind of been one of the big mysteries. But to me, the fact that there hasn't been a whole lot said and written about him, and you haven't seen a whole lot in terms of him being visible. One thing that really stood out to me as far as the introductory press conferences, I don't recall seeing Brady there the day that Mike Elias was introduced. And I could be wrong, so I don't want to say definitively. I don't recall seeing him at the press conference when Brandon Hyde was introduced. So now spring training, I haven't heard that he definitively is not down there, but doesn't seem as though he's had quite the hands-on approach that he's had in the past. So I think it's, with him and with any other if Mike Elias is truly in charge, and this is truly what it's supposed to be and what they advertise it to be from the moment that they introduced him in mid-November, anyone that's still in the organization at this point, it's still going to very much be a work in progress whether individuals stay long-term. I think you see that in any walk of life when there's a new regime. You'll see certain individuals stay on for a time, and then some of them stick long-term, and others will move on after a year or two. So I think that's what's going to be so fascinating in terms of Brady being the most high-profile individual to stay put, but what his role is long-term, I think that's a little more interesting. And but I still think less news or no news is good news rather than there being some sense that he really has his hand in multiple pies as he did in previous years.
Luke Jones is here. He is Luke at WNST.net and Baltimore Luke. He'll be covering all things Orioles baseball as the Orioles roll it out here. The 20 on the outside of the warehouse sort of shows that they don't have much to promote. Elias, Mejdal, and Hyde are now in these power-looking positions in front of the warehouse where they positioned, Roland Heeman 30 years ago and every other Lee Mazzilli and every other management team that's come through here. I'll tell you this, man, I've been around here a long time. This is a group I would buy into in the same way that I thought Andy McPhail knew a lot of institutional baseball. It remained to be seen whether he was still a genius or not. I think he was. And certainly Pat Gillick was a genius and still is a genius. They've had some geniuses. I mean, they really have. I mean, Buck, to some degree, is a baseball sort of savant, very decorated guy, won a lot of ball games. So they've had some geniuses, but this is an impressive group, and they're leaning on it. I don't know how it's marketing, outside of the people that are already baseball fans. But I think the people who are baseball fans, guys like you and me, guys that have read books about this and know the legend of Houston and St. Louis before that and the way the game is played, and even for guys like me that don't understand FIP, that I do understand that they do and respect that they brought in grown-ups. And if the old guy's eating pudding and the kids are out of the way and interested in the racetrack and whatnot. By the way, I love how the Orioles have stepped up to keep the Preakness in Baltimore. They don't care. I'm wondering who's going to step up for Baltimore besides me, Luke, some days. But nonetheless, I'm buying into the fact that these guys, if they're not geniuses, they're at least sharp enough. They're the best that this group's going to get to work for them in the year 2019, right?
Yeah, I mean, these are highly regarded individuals. I mean, even Brandon Hyde, you can look at it one of two ways. He had several other interviews, and you say, okay, well, he didn't get the job anywhere else, but he was well thought of to interview several other places. So it's not as though he's a complete unknown, but certainly Mike Elias and Sig Mejdal, going back to his time with Jeff Luhnow, even going all the way back to St. Louis. I mean, you're talking about guys who have great reputations around baseball. In the case of Elias, someone who has a reputation in the international market as far as being a scout, being a scouting director, doing the things that he did with Houston, and as even before that. But I think it really does bring credibility at a time when there absolutely needs to be credibility. I mean, when you have an ownership situation that is uncertain at best and not knowing exactly what it's going to look like in the future, not knowing when and what the Masson resolution will look like, it's important to have some credibility from a baseball operations standpoint, and I think the Orioles have that now. It doesn't mean it's going to translate to wins and losses.
Because it's not anytime soon, no matter what.
Right, right. It's not going to happen anytime soon, regardless. And it's not a guarantee that the things they did in Houston will work here in Baltimore because, well, things they did in Houston, other teams have paid attention, and it's an arms race. I mean, every team is looking for that edge. It was on OBP with Billy Beane 15 years ago in Oakland. Well, on-base percentage eventually got to a point where everyone valued it, and what happened to it? It became expensive. It was no longer a market inefficiency that you could take advantage of. So you're always looking for that next
The Greek
edge.
god of walks got paid like a god.
yeah. I mean, you're always looking for that next edge. So that's the challenge that the Orioles and every other team faces. So I mean, there are challenges here, but from a credibility standpoint, I don't think the Orioles could have realistically made a better hire. I mean, short of poaching another one of the, who you consider to be the top 5 or 6 GMs in baseball, I don't think you do better than Mike Elias. I really don't, especially when you do factor in some of the questions from an ownership standpoint and uncertainty there. So I think, it's interesting. You mentioned how they're marketing them. Well, you really don't have any players to market right now. And I say that with no disrespect to a Trey Mancini, who I think is a nice player. I say that with no disrespect to a Dylan Bundy or a Cedric Mullins or guys that could be coming in the coming months, such as Austin Hayes and Yusniel Diaz. But none of these guys are Manny Machado. None of these guys are Mookie Betts. None of these guys are even a Vlad Guerrero Jr. in Toronto, who is going to be in the minor leagues a bit longer, and the convenient oblique strain for the Blue Jays to kind of explain away them manipulating his service time further. But you don't have that guy right now. I think one thing that's been interesting to see some of these long-term extensions for some of these young players here over the last few weeks. The Orioles don't really have that young player that you can identify right now that you'd want to give a 5-year, $100 million deal too.
We thought Jonathan Scope was that guy about a minute and a half ago. I mean, I'm not being mean. That's the truth, right?
Sure. But even with Scope, there were questions, and let's face it, he had such a poor time in Milwaukee that he was non-tendered. So maybe he wasn't the right guy to give that to. Certainly, you could have talked about it with Machado 3-4 years ago, but that ship had long sailed over the last year or two. But the point is, you don't really have any players you can market right now. I mean, that's just the truth. So, and I do recall when the Ravens hired Brian Billick way back when, I believe I saw Billick on a billboard or two at that point in time. So it's not completely unheard of to market maybe a manager, maybe not a GM as much, but it's probably not the worst way to try to market. To your point, is it getting any casual fans to buy tickets? No, but I'm not sure putting a billboard out with, like I said, no
Trey
disrespect,
Mancini, right? Yeah,
Trey Mancini. I'm not sure that's selling any tickets either. So that kind of brings us back to what are they doing from a marketing standpoint and how difficult that job is. That's a different topic entirely. But from a baseball standpoint, I feel good, and even just to follow up on that with a more kind of a specific move that they made here over the last week leading into the start of the season. They let Alcides Escobar go, who was not very good the last couple of years in Kansas City. I want to be very clear about that. He wasn't a very good player anymore, but he's a former All-Star, former Gold Glove winner with Kansas City 4 years ago. The Orioles, could they have kept him around from a name recognition standpoint? I guess. He's not selling any tickets, but he's a veteran, and we know.
But instead, give us another Rule 5 shortstop. That's where we want to be, right?
Well, it just comes down to this: if Richie Martin's going to struggle, I'd rather see him struggle than see Alcides Escobar post a negative WAR like he did last year for Kansas City. So I know, Buck Showalter. We talked about this a lot with guys like Craig Gentry and different veterans that, frankly, got too many chances here over the last few years. And I know that the Rule 5 picks are a different conversation when you're a team that's the only drama is, are you going to avoid 100 losses compared to being a team that fancies itself as a contender. But I like seeing them just say, we're not going to keep a guy like Escobar around. We're going to let the Rule 5 picks sink or swim. And if Richie Martin or Drew Jackson end up being a piece that they can move forward with as a nice role player, then great. I mean, this is the kind of team that if you can't have a team like the Orioles carrying 2 or 3 Rule 5 players as they stand in 2019, then you're never going to have a team that's built for carrying a Rule 5 player.
Well, they carried him when they thought they were going to win 102 games. So,
exactly. Right? That's my point. So, I mean, this is the year, by all means, as many Rule 5 guys as you want to try to carry if you think they have a chance to be a decent contributor. And Richie Martin's had a decent spring, and Drew Jackson has played, I think, 5 or 6 different positions and has hit well. It's spring training, I get it. We know spring training numbers are very fickle, very volatile, not very predictive in nature, but it's good to see that, and why not? If it's Rule 5 guys or Alcides Escobar at age 32 and clearly on a sharp decline, I'll take the young guys any day. You're not going to win many games with either scenario, but at least the young guys have a chance to turn into something eventually.
Did you get any warm fuzzies from seeing Machado and Adam Jones hug it out, or no? They'll be hugging it out a lot this year, right? I mean,
yeah. I mean, it was nice to see. I mean, look, as ugly as it was last year, I mean, historically ugly, we all know that. We don't need to rehash that. We all watched it on a nightly basis, and even going back to the final month of 2017, I mean, it's clear the Duquette-Showalter era ended on a very, very, very ugly note. But, you look at those guys, 2012 through 16 was fun, and I'll give you a little different perspective, Nestor. I mean, you lived watching the 83 Orioles and 79 and the 70s, and the Orioles being the class of Major League Baseball for the better part, close to 20 years. They held that title. I didn't live that. My lifetime of Orioles baseball, not counting being 2 years old or 2 weeks old when they last won the World Series, is 1989. Some surprising pseudo-competitive teams in 92 and 93 and 94, 2 playoff teams in 96 and 97, and 2012 through 2016, and 21-31 in the warm and fuzzies with that. I mean, from a wins-losses, from a playoff success standpoint, over the last 35 years, it doesn't get better than what they did from 12 through 16. And I know it didn't end with them reaching the pinnacle, but it was a lot of fun. So, yeah.
Now you know how it feels to be a Chiefs fan.
Yeah, I mean, it was fun. So from that standpoint, seeing Adam Jones and Manny Machado embrace at a Cactus League game a few days back, it was cool to see. And, yeah, the Orioles are going to have a couple reunions with some of these guys, including Machado coming to Baltimore for a couple days in the summer. So, will they draw a few more butts in seats for those games? Maybe a few, but certainly going to be some memories. And it's definitely strange. And we saw this at the end of last year, even in the postseason, seeing some of these guys that were traded off to contenders. If you're an Orioles fan, you can kind of root for some of those individuals, knowing that, yeah, in the standings, it's not going to be pretty for the next few years. I think that much is obvious.
He is Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke on Twitter and Luke at WNST.net. We're getting ready for the baseball season. We have talked about Sig Meindl and Mike Elias and Brandon Hyde and the face of the organization. And kids are going free this year. From a taking the year off standpoint and not watching them every night because they're going to lose but still liking baseball, it's around the corner that Frederick will be playing and Aberdeen will be playing and Bowie will be playing, and Lord knows you'll be going down to the beach and passing Delmarva on the way. And all of these places are going to be dotted with the next round of the Dylan Bundys and Chance Siscos and Trey Mancinis and Yasniel Diaz, at least for the time being, right? What do you think of this? I mean, is this something that you're literally sort of banking on? Like, I'm going to go to Frederick. They're going to have 2 or 3 players that on a Tuesday night will want to do that, or Bowie that there will really be more focus on that amongst people who focus on baseball. That it might be more fun on a nightly basis to see what's going on in Bowie than it will be in July, literally, when the Orioles are whatever godforsaken 35 and 61 they'll be. You know what I mean? The math is going to be bad on this team, and it's going to stack up early based on who they're playing early. You would expect that, and then the sell-off will continue. I do look at it as a night, June, July, and August, dude. It's been a little while since I've been to a Bowie game or an Aberdeen game or a Frederick. You know what I mean? I like baseball, and I live 2 blocks from whatever this is. I'll call it Major League Baseball, and I have no interest in going to the Nationals or I don't. I think it'd be more fun to see what kind of beer they sell in Frederick, and I'm literally being honest, Yeah,
I think that's a fair assessment. I mean, and the thing about the Orioles system, we all know it still needs an influx of talent. There's no doubt about that. I mean, Mike Elias has said that much, that they need to really beef up their talent pipeline to not just open up a 3-year window where they can be competitive in, say, 2023 or whatever it ends up being, but to have that full pipeline that is ongoing. And then you get to a point, and we've seen this. St. Louis is one of the perfect models of this. I mean, yes, do the Cardinals have money to spend? Sure. But what they've been able to do over the last 15 years or so, over the last 20 years or so, has just been they continue to produce major league talent, and you have your guys for their 6 years of club control. You extend a couple of them, you trade a couple of them, and sometimes you lose someone in free agency. I mean, they made a very difficult decision to let Albert Pujols go. And guess what? That was the absolute right decision, and the Angels are paying for that.
And the Orioles made a decision to let go of Nelson Cruz, and that was the wrong decision at that time, right?
Right. But my point is,
all of these are magnified by 1,000,000,000% because of how much money's involved, right? Literally.
Sure. But the point, even with Pujols, I mean, he was a homegrown guy. He was someone from their system, came up out of nowhere in the early 2000s, and was one of the best 5 players in baseball overnight. But because they have talent in their pipeline. And sure, they have more financial flexibility than, say, a Tampa or Oakland or someone like that. But they're not. They haven't been an unlimited budget in the same way that you kind of think of the Yankees or the Dodgers or the Red Sox. They've made good decisions, and the idea is you want to have a farm system with talent at every level, from Aberdeen, the Dominican Summer League, all the way up through AAA. And you want to just have guys that come along every year or two that you have a guy come up from Norfolk this year. You have a couple guys at Bowie that you really like that you think will be ready next year. You have 4 guys at Frederick that you love, knowing that at single A, there's probably still going to be 1 or 2 of them that busts and doesn't really become what you think he might be. But that's the idea. You want to have that talent at every single level. And the Orioles, they have some, but it's certainly not as deep as it needs to be. But but to your point, as far as the interest with the minor leagues, I mean, I think there's plenty. I mean, you look at Yusniel Diaz, who I think a lot of it's going to be when they decide to pull the trigger in terms of from a service time
much like it was for Wieters and every other guy.
Yeah,
right?
I mean every big time prospect teams do that.
Machado, they did that with Machado
until the system is revamped. Well, Machado, that was more a case that he ended up just being so advanced. I don't know if there was ever.
Well, and they were competitive too.
He wasn't ready for the major leagues at the beginning of 2012, but he was by August, and they said, "Hey, let's do it," and they made him third baseman and helped him make the playoffs. But the point is, guys like Diaz, Ryan Mountcastle, Austin Hayes, they're at AAA. They're knocking at the door. If those guys play well, I think there are questions about each of them. Diaz needs to prove he can do it above AA. Mountcastle, I think the bat is really close, but probably going to be playing first base, so he's got to establish himself defensively. Austin Hayes, he had a hell of a spring to the point where a lot of people thought he should have made the team. So go rake at AAA for 2 months and force the Orioles to bring you up. So you have those guys, and then you have guys at some of the lower levels, guys like Grayson Rodriguez, who they drafted last year. D.L. Hall had a fantastic year last year. He was their first-round pick the year before. So they have those guys. And then they have some guys that are more of those fringe types, guys that maybe they end up surprising you, guys like Keegan Aiken and Ryan McKenna and Dean Kramer. And these are guys that are going to be at Bowie and some of them at Frederick. Now, the first 3 that I mentioned, talking Diaz, Mountcastle, and Hayes, they're going to be at Norfolk, so that's a little more of a trip. If you want to make a weekend out of it and go into, drive into Virginia and make that trip, people can do it. But I think there should be a little more interest in the minor leagues. And I didn't even mention a guy like Hunter Harvey, who, if he can ever stay healthy, and look, I'm not counting on it, but I know the new regime loved his arm. If he can finally stay healthy, stay on the mound, I still think he's a guy that could be in the majors next year, dare I say. So it's not as though there aren't any guys that you can point to and have some hope with. It's just there needs to be many more of them, and that's where you have the first overall pick in June. Whether that ends up being Adley Rutschman, the catcher from Oregon State, who everyone is gaga over. It feels a little Matt Wieters, Buster Posey.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's on to him, right? We're all Googling that cat, right?
And look, you never know. I mean, even the Astros, as much as we sing the praises of Elias and Meidel, I mean, they signed or they drafted Brady Aiken, and that didn't work out. So you're not going to bat 1,000, but when you have 1-1 overall, that's a chance to get a franchise-changing kind of individual. That's your chance to get the next Manny Machado, Bryce Harper kind of guy. So that's exciting, and I think even though it didn't work out with Victor Mesa, and with the strategy that Dan Duquette tried to pull on his way out the door, but I think it's very clear that this team is going to be investing more internationally. I know they're laying the groundwork for that, and they have a lot of work to do. That's not something that happens overnight, because that is such a networking kind of deal, and you need to improve your presence down there, facility, people, eyes at games, all of that. I mean, that's not just something where you just say, oh, we're going to spend some money, because everyone can spend the same amount of money, so you do need to outwork people in that regard, outwork other teams in that regard, but they should be able to make some hay with that starting this year, because, well, they're going to be trying, unlike in the past where they didn't even try internationally. So it's going to take some time. It's not as though the Orioles are going to climb from bottom third farm system in baseball to the top 10 overnight, but with a couple years of good drafts and some savvy signings internationally, and that doesn't mean you spend the most money, but you scout and you find the right guys, and you mix in some value signings and some diamonds in the rough with some more notable signings that they haven't made in forever. So,
well, if they make a number 1 overall pick and, he's at Frederick this time next year, that would certainly be the circus, right? Whether it's the catcher or, whether it's somebody's famous son.
Right. I mean, you're hoping, when you're taking that 1-1 guy, I mean, he doesn't need to be in the majors next year, but you're hoping that he's on a fast track. You're hoping that...
Well, you get that Ben McDonald energy going, right?
Yeah, well, I don't know if you want to go that fast, and Ben might tell you that, he might tell you to this day probably wasn't the wisest.
Well, you weren't around for the hype of Ben McDonald, but I was. It was a lot of fun.
I was 6 years old when Ben McDonald was promoted to Baltimore, or just shy of my 6th birthday. Even at that age, I knew how big of a deal he was just because of how much my dad talked about him.
I was drinking beer and grilling a steak on an indoor grill-your-own steak place at 38th Street, what used to be Samantha's in Ocean City with John Raffalidis. And, Johnny and I went in there. We knew, hey, tonight might be the night. And I'll never forget being in the bar and looking up Home Team Sports, and there comes Ben McDonald out of the bullpen, So, man, I mean, that's Oriole baseball, right?
But even think back to Matt Wieters' debut. And look, Matt Wieters...
I was there, the rainbow. I have video of it.
That was exciting. And look, they didn't start winning overnight, but the arrival of Adam Jones through the Bedard trade and Matt Wieters, and then, of course, Machado comes along, and Andy McPhail made some savvy moves and savvy additions, and Dan Duquette made a couple more after that when he arrived. And before you know it, you had a team that won 93 games and was playing in the wild card game in Texas.
Wow, I was so much younger then, dude. I have a video of Matt Wieters creating the rainbow over the warehouse. It was May 29th, 2009. Yeah. And if you look at me, this is 2009, right? Like, the stadium was mobbed. The stadium was they had 42,000 people in the stadium. There were maybe 4,000 empty seats that night.
They announced it. They announced that 2 nights before, I believe, and I know the walk-up sales were ridiculous.
May 29, 2009, yes.
So I was at Matt Wieters' second game. I remember I went with my siblings and my mom. We sat up in the upper deck, way up, and Matt Wieters I believe that was his first major league hit. I don't think he had it in his first game. It was a triple. I remember that, which is hilarious when you consider Matt Wieters.
Dude, how about this? You ready? On Thursday, May 28th, 2009, the Orioles played the Detroit Tigers, and they won 5-1. There were 11,937 people there. And on Friday, May 29th, Bergeson and Willis, a 7-2 victory that evening in front of 42,704. That's when you didn't have to give a bobblehead out. You just had to have a good player. And by the way, Wieters went 0 for 4. 0 for 4 that night. Yes.
Yeah, I saw his first major league hit the following night. It was a triple, which is just hilarious. But my point, to bring it back to what we were talking about.
Where have you gone, Cesar Torres? That's what I want to know.
You want to see the Orioles over the next couple years add at least a couple players who we know aren't going to be in the major leagues overnight, but guys that have the kind of talent that create that kind of hope. And maybe Diaz can be that guy. I mean, I know he turned some heads in the spring, and he showed some pop, and I know a couple chances that I had to see him on television in spring training games before they reassigned him to minor league camp. The bat looks for real, and he's got ability, and he can run. He's got a good throwing arm to probably settle into right field eventually for the Orioles. Is he going to become an MVP candidate? I'm going to guess not on that, but can he be an above-average player that can be a guy that is the start of building around him? And you hope Mancini, you hope Mullins, you hope Chance Sisco's had a decent spring. We'll see. I'm guessing not all those guys are going to fit that description, but you at least start to have a couple of them, and then you add more talent, and guys that are already in the system progress. And come 2020, 2021, 2022, things look a lot brighter than they do right now. I think going back to that Wieters night, going back to the Ben McDonald story, fans just want to have hope. And right now, other than just trusting that they've hired good baseball people, and I think they have, there's not a whole lot you can hang your hat on in terms of hope as far as talent in the system. There are some maybes in the minor leagues, and I think there's some guys you like, Austin Hayes, Diaz, etc., but you need many more of those, and there's certainly no one that fits the description of a Wieters a decade ago or a Machado 7 years ago in this system right now, that's for sure.
He is Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke on Twitter and Luke at WNST.net. I have promised that we will not stop talking about the Orioles, even if they stop playing. We'll continue to talk Oriole baseball through opening day, through the draft season, through the end of the basketball season, all of that stuff as we get going with Oriole baseball. And if it gets really bad, Luke, I'll break the memorabilia out again, all right? I mean, that's I reserve the right to do that on or around Memorial Day. Baltimore Positive is coming. You can find us out in the buyatoyota.com audio vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device by downloading the TuneIn radio app. We do come in crystal clear from anywhere in the world. I am Nestor. We are WNST.net, AM 1570 and WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.